You're not afraid of failing. You're afraid of what happens if you win, the moment you pulled the brake. There's a specific moment most men recognize the instant it's described to them, even though they've spent years avoiding looking at it directly. You're close, not theoretically close. Actually close, the deal is nearly signed. The relationship has reached the point where it could become something real. The body you've been building for months is finally visible. The project you've poured a year into is one final push away from being done. Whatever the specific situation, the shape is the same. You can see the outcome from where you're standing. It's within reach. And then in that exact window, not earlier when things were uncertain and not later when the outcome is already settled, something happens. You miss the deadline you'd been tracking carefully for weeks. You start a fight with the person you've been building something with, over something that, in hindsight, didn't deserve the intensity you brought to it. You stop showing up the way you had been, right when consistency mattered most. You find a reason, always a reasonable-sounding one, to step back from the exact thing you'd been moving toward. Afterward, you have an explanation ready. You were tired. The timing wasn't right, something more important came up. And each explanation, taken individually, sounds plausible enough. But if you zoom out and look at the pattern across years, not just this one instance, something becomes difficult to ignore. This doesn't happen randomly. It happens at a specific point in the process, right at the threshold, right when winning stops being theoretical and starts being real. Most men interpret this as bad luck, or poor discipline, or simply not wanting the thing badly enough. They tell themselves a story about insufficient motivation, and they try to fix it with more willpower, more discipline, more pressure on themselves to push through next time. But willpower was never the actual variable, because the pattern doesn't look like someone who lacks motivation. It looks like someone who is actively, if unconsciously, applying the brake at a very specific and very repeatable point in the process. If failure isn't actually what you're afraid of, then something else is generating this pattern, and it's not what you've been telling yourself. Why failure was never the real threat. Here's an idea that contradicts almost everything self-help culture has taught men to believe about themselves. Failure is rarely the thing people are protecting themselves from. Failure is familiar. For most people who struggle with this exact pattern, failure isn't a frightening unknown. It's a return to known territory. It confirms a story that's already been quietly installed for years. A story about not being quite good enough, not quite ready, not quite the person who gets to have the thing they've been working toward. Failing doesn't threaten that story. It validates it. This is uncomfortable to consider, but worth sitting with directly. The nervous system doesn't prioritize comfort. It prioritizes predictability. And a familiar disappointment, however painful, is more predictable, and therefore in some strange way safer, than an unfamiliar success whose consequences haven't been mapped out yet. Success, by contrast, is unmapped territory. It doesn't confirm the old story, it contradicts it. And contradicting a long-held internal narrative, even with good news, creates a specific kind of psychological turbulence that most people have never been taught to recognize, let alone navigate. Think about what success actually requires once it arrives. New visibility, people now watching you in a way they weren't before. New expectations, both from others and from yourself, since the bar you've now proven you can clear becomes the new minimum. New responsibility, for maintaining something rather than simply pursuing it. None of that existed as a felt reality before the threshold was crossed. All of it becomes immediately real the moment it is. So the mind, operating well below the level of conscious strategy, makes a calculation. Staying in the familiar territory of near success and near failure, the place where the old story remains intact and no new demands have been activated, feels safer than crossing into territory where an entirely different version of yourself would be required to function. This isn't laziness, it isn't lack of ambition. It's closer to a protective recalibration executed by a part of the mind that has learned somewhere along the way that the old story is at least survivable, even if it's painful, while the new territory remains completely untested. Which means the thing your mind is actually trying to avoid isn't the pain of losing. It's something that comes attached to winning. And once you see what that is, the pattern stops being mysterious. The identity success demands that you haven't built yet. Here's the core of what's actually happening, stated as directly as possible. Winning doesn't just change your circumstances. It demands a different person to occupy them. This is easy to underestimate, because most people think of success primarily in terms of external change. More money, more recognition, a different relationship, a healthier body. But every one of those external changes comes paired with an internal requirement that rarely gets discussed. To sustain the promotion, you need to become someone who can operate at that level consistently, not just perform well enough once to get noticed. To sustain the relationship that's becoming real, you need to become someone capable of being truly known, not just charming enough to be initially desired. To sustain the physical transformation, you need to become someone whose identity includes discipline as a permanent trait, not a temporary effort. That required identity doesn't exist yet at the moment of approaching the threshold. It hasn't been built. And some part of the psyche, sensing this gap between the identity required and the identity currently available, registers the approaching success as a kind of structural risk, not unlike a building being asked to support a load it wasn't designed to carry. Seneca, writing to Lucilius, made an observation that still lands with unusual precision today. He warned that few things are more dangerous to a person's character than prolonged uninterrupted success, not because success itself is corrupting, but because it demands a strength of character that hasn't necessarily been developed yet. Difficulty, in his framework, builds the capacity required to handle ease. Without that capacity already in place, success doesn't liberate a person. It exposes them. This reframes the entire pattern in a way that's genuinely useful. You're not avoiding the result. You're avoiding the gap between who the result requires you to be and who you currently are. And that gap, left unexamined, will generate retreat after retreat. Not because you don't want the outcome, but because some part of you correctly senses that you haven't yet built the person capable of holding it. And this is where something even more uncomfortable starts to surface. Because this fear isn't random. It has a very specific origin. Where this fear actually comes from. Fear of success rarely originates in adulthood. It's almost always older than the career, the relationship, or the goal currently triggering it. And when you trace it back far enough, a specific kind of memory tends to surface, not always dramatic but consistently formative. For many men, success at some point in childhood or adolescence came attached to an unexpected cost. Maybe doing well in school created distance from friends who didn't, and the result was a quiet, confusing isolation nobody warned you about. Maybe excelling at something drew a level of attention from a parent, praise, expectation, pressure, that felt heavier than it should have, turning achievement into a source of anxiety rather than pride. Maybe being the capable one in the family meant absorbing responsibilities that no child should have to carry, simply because competence was noticed and then quietly relied upon. In each of these scenarios, success wasn't simply rewarded. It was followed by something costly enough that the nervous system took note. Not consciously. Children don't reason their way through cause and effect with this kind of precision, but emotionally an association forms. Doing well leads to consequences I didn't expect and don't know how to manage. And once that association is laid down early enough, it doesn't require active belief to keep operating. It just runs quietly, every time a similar threshold approaches again. Carl Jung wrote extensively about the unconscious mind's tendency to protect the familiar, even when the familiar is limiting or painful. The psyche isn't oriented toward growth by default. It's oriented toward equilibrium, toward maintaining whatever pattern has proven survivable, regardless of whether that pattern is actually serving the person anymore. If success once meant unexpected loss of closeness, of simplicity, of belonging, then a part of the unconscious will continue treating success as a threat long after the original context has disappeared entirely. This is why understanding the pattern intellectually so often fails to change it. You can know with complete clarity that there's no rational reason to fear your current promotion or your current relationship. But the part of you generating the retreat isn't operating on current information. It's operating on an old emotional record that was never updated because nobody ever went back to update it. Once that connection exists, self-sabotage stops being a flaw and starts being a strategy. And strategies, no matter how outdated, are very difficult to retire without a different kind of work. Self-sabotage is not weakness. It's an old strategy still running. This reframe matters more than it might initially seem, because the language people use to describe this pattern shapes how they respond to it. Calling it weakness invites shame. It suggests a character flaw, something fundamentally lacking that needs to be overcome through sheer force of will. And shame as a motivational strategy has a remarkably poor track record. It doesn't dissolve the underlying mechanism. It just adds a layer of self-punishment on top of a pattern that was never about laziness or insufficient desire to begin with. Calling it an old strategy changes the entire relationship to the behavior. A strategy was built for a reason. It served a purpose once, even if that purpose has expired. And strategies, unlike character flaws, can be examined, updated, and eventually replaced, without requiring you to believe there's something broken at the core of who you are. The part of you that pulls the brake right before a win isn't trying to prevent your success out of malice or self-destruction. It's trying to prevent a repeat of an old unprocessed cost that became associated with achievement a long time ago. It's not betraying you. It's protecting you, using outdated information applied to a present situation that no longer matches the conditions under which the strategy was originally built. This connects directly to something worth sitting with honestly. The version of you that learned success was dangerous is not the version of you standing at today's threshold. That younger version didn't have the resources to handle what success required back then. The isolation, the pressure, the unexpected responsibility. But you right now are not operating with those same limitations. You have capacities that version of you didn't have. Perspective, distance, the ability to choose a different response, even when the old alarm starts ringing. The problem isn't that the alarm exists. The problem is that nobody ever taught it, that the building it's protecting has been renovated. It's still responding as though the original danger were current, because nothing has explicitly told it otherwise. Understanding this is significant, but understanding alone has never stopped anyone from pulling the brake again. What actually interrupts the pattern is something more specific: how to recognize the brake before you pull it. Here's where this becomes practical, because insight without intervention simply produces a more articulate version of the same pattern. The brake doesn't get pulled at the moment of obvious crisis. It gets pulled in small, easy-to-rationalize behaviors that show up in the days or hours leading into a significant threshold. Learning to recognize those behaviors in real time, before they fully execute, is the actual point of intervention, far more useful than trying to analyze the pattern after the damage has already occurred. There are a few specific signals worth watching for directly. A sudden wave of procrastination on a task that until recently you were handling without difficulty, particularly when that task is the final step before a visible result. An unexplained urge to create conflict with someone important, especially when that conflict seems to come from nowhere and feels disproportionate once you're far enough outside it to evaluate it honestly. A pull toward isolation or withdrawal precisely when visibility is increasing, fewer messages returned, more cancelled plans, a general retreat from the people who would otherwise witness the success as it unfolds. None of these behaviors announce themselves as self-sabotage. Each one comes with a perfectly reasonable explanation attached. That's what makes them effective as defense mechanisms. They're not obviously self-destructive. They're disguised as ordinary decisions, ordinary moods, ordinary bad days. Epictetus taught a discipline that applies directly here. The practice of pausing to examine your own impressions before acting on them, rather than treating every internal impulse as automatically true or necessary to obey. Applied to this pattern, the practice looks like this. When you notice procrastination, conflict, or withdrawal emerging specifically near a significant threshold, pause before acting on the impulse. Ask one direct question. Is this genuinely about the task, the person, or the situation in front of me, or is this showing up right on schedule, the way it always does when something important is about to be real? That question doesn't eliminate the impulse instantly, but it interrupts the automatic execution long enough for a more deliberate choice to become possible. And repeated enough times, that interruption is what actually begins to retrain the old alarm. Not through force, but through consistent, lived evidence that the threshold can be crossed without the disaster the nervous system has been quietly expecting. Becoming someone who can hold the win. There's a question worth asking directly, now that the entire pattern has been laid out. What would actually change if you stopped treating this as a character flaw and started treating it as exactly what it is? An outdated protection system, still running on information that hasn't been true for years. You're not afraid of failing. Failure was never the threat. What you've been protecting yourself from is the unfamiliar weight of becoming someone you haven't built yet. A version of yourself capable of holding visibility, expectation, and responsibility that the old story never accounted for. That fear is real. It deserves to be taken seriously, not mocked or willed away, but it is not a verdict on your character. And it is not evidence that you don't actually want what you say you want. Here's what's worth understanding before you try to change anything. The identity required to sustain success doesn't need to be fully built before you cross the threshold. That's the assumption that keeps most men stuck at the exact same point year after year. The belief that they need to feel completely ready, completely transformed, completely deserving before they're allowed to win. But readiness was never a precondition for crossing. It's a byproduct of crossing. You don't become the person who can hold the win and then win. You win imperfectly while still becoming that person, and the holding gets built in real time through the discomfort of actually occupying the new territory rather than retreating from it. Seneca wrote that difficulty builds the strength required to handle ease. The reverse is also true, even though it's discussed far less often. Ease, once you finally allow yourself to remain inside it instead of fleeing back to familiar struggle, builds its own kind of strength. The strength of tolerating visibility without disappearing, of receiving recognition without deflecting it, of staying in a relationship that's becoming real without manufacturing a reason to create distance. None of that strength exists in advance. It exists only because you stayed long enough for it to form. This is where the practical work actually lives, not in waiting until you feel ready, but in staying one beat longer than the old alarm wants you to stay. The next time you notice the procrastination, the unnecessary conflict, the urge to withdraw right as something important is becoming real, you now have language for what's happening. You can name it without shame, and naming it accurately is what creates the half-second of space where a different choice becomes available, not eliminating the old fear entirely, but refusing to let it drive on autopilot the way it always has before. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself repeatedly that obstacles often contain the path forward rather than blocking it. The same is true here in reverse. The approach of success is not the obstacle. Your relationship to what success demands of you, that's the actual terrain to work with. And every time you stay one moment longer than the old pattern wants you to, you're not just finishing a task or holding a relationship together. You're quietly building the exact identity that was missing before, One small act of staying at a time. You don't need to feel ready. You need to stay long enough to find out you already are. If something in this video felt uncomfortably specific to your own life, that recognition is worth taking seriously. It usually means a pattern that's been operating quietly for years, just got named out loud for the first time. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications if this kind of conversation is something you want more of. And leave a comment, not as a formality, but because I genuinely read everyone. Many of the topics covered here started exactly that way, in something someone shared that hadn't quite found words anywhere else. Because that's really what this channel is for. A place where the patterns that quietly run people's lives get named clearly enough to finally be worked with, instead of just endured in silence. You are not the only one pulling the brake right before the win, and you are not the only one capable of finally staying long enough to hold it. Thank you for being here. See you in the next one.